The behemoth of the battlefield, the landship, the tank, a vehicle that was built out of necessity at a time where every move was even more uncertain than the next. 100 years later, we take a lot of these technologies for granted, and as a part of this running series on this channel, I'm sure that we will be covering a lot of them. But the tank that we know today is the result of countless revisions and evolutions. The British Mark I to the Mark X tank, quite literally the first tank in the world, became quite the icon of the Great War, and originally was introduced with different intentions than we might think. The Great War bridged this gap between tradition and modern. We saw such a vast evolution and the advancement of warfare over the course of the years that it lasted. No longer were men standing shoulder to shoulder in fields, nor were they on skirmishes or using guerrilla tactics to outsmart or outflank their opponents. It was both old and new. We could say that there was an almost archaic attitude towards warfare that, well, resulted in untold mass casualties, diseases, and the grossest imaginable conflict in our written history. Even to this day, it must be unlike anything that we can perceive ourselves. And to think that I lost a grandparent back then, and how this history interweaves and how we're all so connected to this past, this very distant past, but it's still relevant today. Now, the French front lines were relatively flat, depending on where you were in the landscape. There were barely any areas for strategic advantage, and what ended up happening is trench fortifications were built purely because neither side was able to advance any further than their opposition. Shelling became the mainstay. So you're pushing towards a position, and the safest bet instead of going back is to literally dig in and hold position. Failure to advance or retreat, both decided to just dig in and hold the line. This is where all of the iconic imagery comes from, but also where the greatest problem reared its head. With all of the supposed protection that these trenches offered, they also became perfect targets for mortars and artillery. I will let you take a guess how many shells were fired over the course of the Great War on the Western Front. What are we saying, like 100 million, 200 million? It couldn't be more than 300 million, surely. 1.5 billion. That's a billion with a B. Along with this continual chaos that they had to endure, the men's movement in these trenches were limited, and they were literally standing in these tight corridors for years on end. Let's not even get into the contaminants they lived with. Then when the time came for the whistles to be blown and the men to cross no man's land, well, it became a killing field. Truly horrendous. Now, maybe this was seen as something honorable at the time. We've got to remember that we were just leaving the Victorian era and arriving in the modern period. But this was a traditionalist approach to a modern war. And the sheer disregard for human life, it's disgusting. Ultimately, this back and forth, shelling between both sides, both being stuck with nowhere to go, it prolonged the war far longer than anyone had thought. But it was clear that nobody had the upper hand. And frankly, it was seen as a stalemate with no solution by the end of the first year. Now, where there were innovations in the areas of reconnaissance and airplanes, more on that in future videos, there was still nothing truly effective at crossing these open stretches of land on foot or on wheels. I mean, yes, they did have horses and there were cavalry charges at times. I mean, the Battle of Verdun was nicknamed the Meat Grinder. But putting that aside, what is mind-blowing to think is that the internal combustion engine was in its early stages of development at this point. And with it came the ability to carry heavy loads and to move faster and with greater efficiency. With all of the advantages that it offered, so the development of these armoured vehicles began in 1915 as a joint venture between the British and the French. Now, the name tank was a deceptive one. It was a code name. Both troops, even the high-ranking officers, thought that these were large water tanks or some kind of transport vehicle that carried water to the troops on the front lines. They were even positioned in a way to come across like this for aerial reconnaissance. Incredible to think how a name sticks, how this has become the official term for a tank, a deceptive code name. As we know, these machines were fully armor-plated, built to withstand virtually anything thrown at them, or so they thought. The Mark I's purpose was to traverse no man's land and provide supplies, cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and provide cover for troops. Also acting as a larger-than-life scapegoat to draw fire away from the troops as they advanced. And it needs to be said that if you were designated the role as a tank operator, this was extremely prestigious at the time. Now, we will leave aside the prototypes that came before the Mark I. Frankly, they aren't much to look at. I don't think you want me to cover Big Willie and Little Willie in this video. I mean, such original names, they're fantastic. And these were the true first tanks ever constructed. Believe it or not, these were given to an agricultural contractor to develop. We need to remember that these were essentially tractors with armored plates on them. The foundation of the Mark I tank was established on the potential of its trench crossing abilities, Now, due to technicalities, turrets were not added to the top of the machine, but rather onto its sides, which had far more practical applications at giving it a lower center of gravity and operation. Now, if we look at a side profile of these peculiar machines, they have a rhomboidal shape, which is very different. Very unusual even at the time, but it was done deliberately. They would have an easier time climbing uneven surfaces, and of course, since they were going from trench to trench, this would make a lot of sense. From time to time, you will also see some distinctive bundles of sticks on their roofs, and these are called fascines, a very simple method of deploying a ramp over an uneven surface. And as the months went by, the base of the Mark I became more sophisticated and ultimately ended up as the Mark X configuration by the end of the war. There are too many variations to cover in one video, the males using 6-pound guns, the females using mounted machine guns only. But these tanks with their large sizes were able to carry heavy loads. They would transport equipment. Later you would start seeing more protective additions of roll bars across the body, some with mesh roofs that would protect the top from mortars and artillery, the typical debris they would receive. So looking at the general style of the Mark series of tanks, you can see that there is a heavy naval influence. I mean, the name Landship comes from a Navy background. The fact that there was an entire branch of the military that focused on developing the Landship. Just by some simple examples you can see on the sides of it, it used traditional naval sponsons. But what is quite interesting when you look at it entirely, yes, it's a weird object, but there is an air of streamlining to it. This could come from its rhomboidal shape, it could come from its flat profile, and it does have this characteristic, this air of a ship tied to it. Now, if we are to look at the whole focus of streamlining again, the tracks and the body being one unit was so innovative, so forward-thinking for the time, especially how the shape of the body was designed with its main purpose of being able to traverse objects easier. And as we can see, which was typical of the time, when in doubt, add a rivet. Scratch that, add a rivet on top of the rivet. Do whatever you have to do. Now, talking about its exterior and its purpose is all well and good. It's nice to see it on paper, but we need to spare a thought for the operators. These 8 men were thrown into this machine, which had 0 comforts. I mean, less than 0. There was no separation between the Daimler sleeve valve engine, which was running at full tilt. So it was extremely loud, so loud that sound deadening devices didn't help in the slightest. These operators were exposed to the dangers of exhaust fumes, not just the poisonous gases, carbon dioxide, but also the secret killer, carbon monoxide. All the heat that engine produced was contained inside this machine. So they were boiling, experiencing unnatural temperatures, something as high as 50 degrees Celsius and beyond. And they probably lost their body weight in water through sweat. Adding to all of this, they had to operate a machine that was not easy to maneuver or steer, that was slow, I mean it weighed 30 tons. And bearing in mind it was one of the primary targets on the battlefield, it was the biggest thing there. So they received fire from small arms all the way to mortars and artillery, later armor-piercing rounds, which very often disabled these tanks. They set them ablaze. There were stories about how these tanks would return from the front lines with the whole side silver. I mean, specks of silver. Paint had been almost completely removed. So I don't think we can imagine what it must have been like being inside these mobile, stinking hot metal coffins. Here's the question though. Was the Landship, the tank, the innovation that ended the war? Was it an unstoppable force? No, it really wasn't. It had plenty of weaknesses, especially in the muddy terrains they operated in. We have this image in our minds that these tanks rolled through the battlefields uncontested and pushed back the lines and changed the course of the war. But in the early years of their introduction, they were seen as quite a military shortcoming. They were breaking down before they even reached the front lines, or getting so clogged up with mud on the front line, they just broke down right there in the middle of the field. Or of course getting hit by artillery and becoming immobile. But where they might have lacked in the technologies and the abilities that we see tanks offer today, they were incredible morale boosters. For both civilians and troops, their larger-than-life size, the pure intimidation alone did a fantastic job. Maybe they weren't as practical on the front lines offensively, but they were pathfinders. They did bridge gaps, they did push forward, and they did cross the terrain. They were excellent machines on the ground for support. Now the tank lives on today, formidable, intimidating, all-terrain vehicles as pieces of mobile artillery that has literally shaped on-the-ground modern warfare in virtually all respects. Something we will touch on at a later date. And the earliest tanks, though they were underpowered, extremely heavy, difficult to maneuver, a real health hazard to operate, these were the concepts that proved that an idea like this was possible, and ultimately showed how much of a success it would end up being. If you have any ideas for future videos, any kinds of innovations, past or present, that you want discussed, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. I just want to thank all of you who have joined this channel, who have subscribed to the page. It really means a lot. This has been a passion project of mine I've wanted to get off the ground for a very long time, so Your support is amazing. That's all I can say. Thank you. More videos to come.